All right. So, hey, let's get kicked off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Phosphorus Live. This is our bi-weekly look at the very interesting world of xIoT, the extended Internet of Things. I'm your host, Mike Huckaby. I'm VP of Sales Engineering here at Phosphorus, and I'm joined by our device-obsessed Director of Sales Engineering, James McCarthy. Say hi, James.
Hello.
And we're happy to have you join us. We get together every 2 weeks to provide some education on the connected devices that we all use to run our businesses on these days, and to give some insight into what Phosphorus does to help keep those devices secure. Format is simple. We have a quick discussion on a specific topic, and then a Phosphorus technical take related to that topic. It's a quick hit, less than 30 minutes. We're going to include some Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat as we're sitting here, and we'll address them at the end. And today's topic is, boom. What's my age again? Who am I? This is part 2 of our maturity journey conversation, concentrating on identity management in xIoT. But before we jump into that, there's a lot that's been going on, James. So what's new at the the xIoT news desk?
Yeah, well, I spent a lot of time this week trying to think of, some of the different topics and things I wanted to cover when I was researching what's going on in the wonderful world of xIoT. But I kept coming back to obviously the biggest piece of news in the news cycle in the cybersecurity world and IT world in general, and that's the Crowdstrike outage, right? So Crowdstrike is in the news this past week because of an outage that's impacted millions of people worldwide, myself included. And everyone's heard of the impact, and a lot of people are obviously quick to blame CrowdStrike for this, and rightfully so. But I think I'm seeing a little bit of that blame start shifting towards Microsoft. So I wanted to spend just a moment here today, real quick, and just kind of provide my take on what happened here and why I think trying to shift some of this or trying to lump Microsoft into this problem is actually a bad thing. And I think it's a little misleading in the sense. And I think CrowdStrike should shoulder all of this blame. But the root cause here of this, we've kind of heard here and there bits and pieces, was obviously a piece of code in the CrowdStrike Falcon engine. And the Falcon engine would cause an issue with a specific file. And unfortunately, that file is in the kernel of the Windows operating system. And so when that outage took place, millions of, and I think the count right now is 8.5 million systems worldwide were impacted and then went into a blue screen loop, right? Blue screen of death. And so where it gets complicated, though, is that, the people keep associating this issue and saying that, hey, this is a Microsoft thing as well, because it's a, blah, blah, blah. It's a blue screen of death issue, so they should shoulder the blame. First of all, CrowdStrike has actually caused similar issues already in the past couple of months. They didn't quite hit the news cycle because the impact wasn't nearly as substantial as what it was with the Windows outage here. But there were several versions of Linux that the CrowdStrike engine had actually caused the same issue with over the past, I think, 3 or 4 months. And so this isn't something that was a one-off anomaly for CrowdStrike. So this is actually something that's now been kind of a recurring theme for them. And why that is, we don't know. But the idea here with Windows and why I think people are shifting some of this blame into Microsoft is because the underlying problem with this technology is that CrowdStrike has kernel level access to the operating system. That is something that inherently comes with a lot of risk. And if you're in the IT stack and you have to own the IT infrastructure and make these decisions, every time you bring in a third-party application that requires kernel level access to your operating system fleet, you're introducing a ton of vulnerability, right? Whether it's the actual vulnerabilities in the code itself, or just in the operational risk, which we're seeing, the result of here. And so I don't think Microsoft shouldering this blame is really a genuine thing. And the reason why I'm saying that, and I'm seeing a lot of it in the news right now, is because for the last 5 to 7 years or so, Microsoft has been trying to shift that concept of allowing third parties with kernel access to their platform and shifting that into an API level access where they're going to act and kind of create a gateway or an intermediary between the third party application and the kernel. for obvious reasons that would reduce risk, that would reduce complexity. The reason why most of these third parties have access to the kernel is actually just a speed and efficiency trade-off. It's not really a security thing. And so Microsoft has made attempts in the past to do this, but more recently, they actually could, to Microsoft's credit, saw this problem coming. They could see that the issue, the risk around a third party having kernel access was pretty significant. So for a while, they had been developing an actual API specifically targeted towards third-party security vendors. And this API would essentially provide the same visibility and efficacy to the companies like Crowdstrike in the world, but without giving them direct kernel access. That's great, except when Microsoft went to the EU and tried to propose this, the EU anti-competitive regulators actually shot this down, and they prohibited Microsoft from implementing this because they were concerned that it would provide an unfair advantage to the larger security vendors compared to the smaller ones. And so for me, it's an interesting story because it's a case where, and I'm not going to take a stance one way or the other, whether that was the right decision or not. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about, the complex regulatory requirements out there, but it highlights the fact that Microsoft did see this coming. They attempted to try and solve this problem, but ultimately third-party vendors having that kernel level hook into an operating system is here to stay for at least the near term, and is a very big source of potential risk in an environment. And so good to see that. And I think hopefully the market starts to understand that and kind of course corrects a little bit and takes some of this off of Microsoft's shoulders and firmly onto CrowdStrike's, but we'll see. That's not really up to me.
It's a really interesting take, James, on that, and you've educated me a little bit on some of the nuance there as well, and so very, very interesting. And hopefully Microsoft keeps going down that path. And what kind of thinks to me, kind of in our realm too, is can you imagine with the highly tuned OT devices that are out there, if somebody was getting kernel level access to things in firmware to put security tools on that, how disruptive that could be. And I think one of the reasons why, there's never really been a good play in being able to create an external security agent for O2 devices, right?
Yeah, exactly that. The risk, it's funny because as an industry, we understand the risk of putting a third-party agent on a device. We would see that and say, well, that's bad, right? We don't want to do that. Even if it were technically feasible. It's such a huge source of risk. Yet we do that all the time on the IT side of the house. It's such a weird dichotomy between those two things.
Right. Well, very cool. It's going to be an interesting story seeing how this goes and how it impacts the industry, our overall industry over the next couple of months. So really cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, lots going on. So if we kind of move over to kind of our topic for the day. Now, we have on the show talked in the past about maturity journey across xIoT and how organizations can move forward with developing a comprehensive xIoT security program and what those steps are. Now, when an organization is kind of creating the security programs, there are many elements and many groups and people that might be involved. And the larger the company, typically the more complex. And so a lot of organizations are looking for guidance in creating these. Now, CISA, of course, they put together a lot of different guidances, and this is one, their zero trust is a zero trust model for maturity. And you see a lot of organizations that look at these and try to adopt these. And these, like a zero trust model, you can see it trying to bleed over and influence the xIoT policies. And remember, the convergence of the OT organization and the IT organization, they've made efforts to try to create common policy across both OT and IT, but there continues to be a great sensitivity in how far the OT side will actually go to adopt a framework like a zero trust type of framework. But some common things I think always need to be addressed no matter which side you're on. And the first thing we all typically look at is, what do we have? What are our assets? What are the devices on the xIoT side? What are the devices that we have in our environment? What do we actually have working? And then pretty soon after that, you start thinking, now that I have them there, how do I access them and how do I interact with them? Now, you've got an entire group of people probably in your organization that is focused at how you access things, mostly PCs and servers, and that's the identity team. So that identity team has a big involvement in trying to build out how we're going to be accessing anything from an xIoT environment across this as well. And even though kind of we might be focused at assets, you know, there's a whole team there that's looking at the identity management program, and it might look something like this. So this is a typical kind of identity management program internally to an organization. Now, of course, you start with identities, but identity is the makeup of everything it is. It's not just a username and password. It's probably way less than that. It's about attributes that make up who you are. It's about the things that are all of your traits or a thing's traits that are going to be captured about that. That helps us know what it is. Credential management is more along the lines of how do I establish that identity? How do I prove that identity? How do I make sure in an organization that identity is the one that I expect it to be? And then finally, there's the access management piece of it, which is what are those identities? What can they do? Where can they go? And what do I need to do once I've established that identity? What level of trust do I provide them at any given time? Now, of course, over the last 15 years, federation of that identity so that I don't have to have multiple identities. I can use one across the way. That has to be a key part. We find that in so many organizations that we work with because we're asked to say our existing federation capabilities, how can that extend to xIoT? But one of the big things to consider is the governance and the policies that get out there. Most governance policies don't specifically address xIoT. I think there's an assumption that the policies you put in place about your identity management program affects and applies to xIoT, but I really don't think any of that really happens. So every day, if you own the xIoT environment, if you own any kind of devices, cameras, printers, door controllers, or the like, you're probably out of compliance and out of compliance with your own internal policy. Now, I know it's kind of a difficult issue. It's if you have so many things, you're not really worried about a person identity in that case. You're worried about establishing a device identity in the environment and then accessing it. And that access may have to be through some other third-party tool to get to it. For an example, if you have a camera, you may be accessing that camera through some other tool to see what that camera sees. So there's some complexity at doing this, especially at doing it at scale. And that makes a lot of people just step back and start saying, well, my identity management program that has probably been built over the last 25 years and how I manage credentials, only do we find like now in the last year and a half that companies are really focused at saying, let's take those policies and really let's extend it to every single asset. Again, convergence of IoT, the IT side and OT side is helping to kind of push the corporate identity management programs down into these sides of the business that typically have never been touched. Now, as again, we've talked a little bit about the maturity model that around the xIoT environment, especially if you're trying to make sure that you increase security. And we usually start when we talk with organizations, customers of ours, it's about what devices do I have and where do they exist? What do I actually have out there? And what are the vulnerabilities that you can expose to me about that? So that's a quick hit. It's quick, easy. In 15 minutes, we give you a pretty good sense of that. But then decisions start having to be made. And the first decision that we recommend coming back with is let's harden those devices by making sure we understand that those devices have, one, not the default credentials that the device came with, and two, are in some kind of rotation schedule so that they're constantly updated and that information is captured. That we get away from managing those passwords, either never changing them or keeping them in a spreadsheet, to a more full security program that's focused at managing the identities for those devices. So as soon as you know it, our recommendation is to start looking right at the identity of that device and start managing right away. Now, I believe that in our product, we actually have some very cool ways to be able to help you then manage this scary idea about doing this at scale. So, James, can I ask you to kind of give your technical take here?
Yeah, I want to start with pointing out something I think it goes kind of unspoken in this conversation here often, because it's such a concept that's a little bit unique to the world as we see it at Phosphorus, and that is the concept of identity management. Like you've talked about here, is a very well thought through concept on the IT side of the house. When we think about identity with the traditional sense, it's a user account and a login, but it's a person right behind that login. And that person has a department they belong to. That person's working on projects. They have a geolocation that they live in, right? And so we factor all of those different attributes into a person's identity. And the more advanced solutions that are out there will actually use that context to make decisions, right? Can they log in and go access this resource or access that resource? And those decisions, those yes and no's, are based on a lot of that context around who that identity is, who is that person, and why are they trying to access those things. I think in the IoT space, we have something similar there. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about that, because when you think about identity in the IoT space, people always, if you ask them that question, they go straight to, well, it has a login credential, so that's the identity, right? That's simple. It's got a login, a username, password, problem solved. But in IoT, we also have context. We have all of those other things like we do on the IT side of the house, because a device has functionality, it has a purpose, and it has to do things or not do things based on that context. And so we can see things like an identity on a device. We have the credential pair, but is that device risky? Is it out of date? Does it have SSH enabled, right? Does it have all of these other attributes that can dictate whether or not we should allow somebody to access the device, or even allow the device to do something on the network, right? And so there's this kind of, I think, a marriage of IoT and IT in terms of identity management that we could definitely probably do another 2 or 3 sessions on this if we really wanted to. But it's just something I was thinking about too, the other day, of just how identity is more complex than just simply the username and password, right? There's so much more context to that. Right. But that said, today I want to actually show a little bit here about how our platform, and really, even if you weren't using our platform, just how complex the problem is. Because yes, we think about identity at the device level as a username and password. We can go out and find those credentials, we can manage them, we can do other things. But that's not always as simple as just a simple username and password on a device. Sometimes there are devices that have 2 or 3 different accounts that you can leverage that have different functions, right? We have infusion pumps for hospitals that actually have 3 different credentials associated with the same device. And based on how you log in, it can actually dictate what you can or can't do on that device. The problem with those devices is, unfortunately, all 3 of those accounts ship with default credential. So it's still very insecure when it comes out of the box. But it's great that it at least has this concept of role-based access control baked into the device. Now, that's the exception to the rule, not generally the rule. Most devices are more simple than that. But what I want to show here, just really quickly, I'm going to just show a device and log into a camera here. It's something, we see these all the time, right? These are pretty common in our customer base. Axis is a ubiquitous IP camera company. When we look at this device, the first thing we do in a customer's organization when we discover one of these is we say, okay, hey, what's your identity, right? What are you running as by default? And so we're going to try and use those default credentials first. So we're going to try and log in. In this case, it's root and pass. So, very secure username and password pairing. But we always try that first to check, because the first thing we want to know from a kind of an identity standpoint is, could an attacker simply Google the credentials, right? If that's true, let's fix that problem first. What we also try to do is say, okay, is this device something that falls into that concept of multiple identities, right? Do we know that this device, because when we talk and set up profiles for these things, we're very thorough with how we do that. And so we say, okay, does this have multiple credentials? Does it have a single credential? In this case here, I'm going to show this. If I click show device password, we have a nice complex password. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. Let's log in to that camera. And we can see that we're now into the stream. That's great. But now what if this was actually running the default credentials, right? We know with access cameras, the default credentials are root and pass. So I'm going to go ahead and change that back to the default credentials as soon as I get rid of Zoom's overlay. There we go. So now we know that this is running root and pass. So if I go root and pass, we're back into the system, right? If I come here and click interrogate, what we're going to do is we're actually going to check that camera. We're going to log into it. And we're going to say, hey, what's actually running on this device? And in this case here, we know, oh, maybe a camera went offline here, but we know that this is running root and pass. And so for us at Phosphorus, how do we at scale not only identify that and go out and find all of that in the wild, but then how do we fix that, and how do we actually implement that? And if you're thinking about IT policies, and especially in the identity space, I mean, we all work at companies, right? So we all have to deal with, every 6 months our password changes, or every 12 months, or whatever your company's policy is. And we know that there's not only a time limit on the credential, but we also know that there's a complexity requirement, right? So we know that if you go in and try to set your password to test, you're probably going to get rejected, right? And so for us, we want to make sure that we're able to understand the policy requirements of the device when we do these things. But we also want to make it simple for organizations to say, okay, if our corporate IT policy is to rotate a credential every 6 months or every 90 days or whatever it is, and we need it to be complex, then in Phosphorus, you could actually dictate that and say, okay, for all of my devices, every 90 days or every 180 days, whatever you want to do, we're going to rotate those credentials. We're going to make sure that they meet the maximum complexity requirements of those devices. And we're going to make sure that that maintains a kind of up-to-date status, and enroll those credentials into some sort of vault, right? So we're going to store those either in our vault or with a third-party integration. But the idea is we're providing a simple, clean, very easy interface between the device and the IT policy for identity, right? And we're going to bridge that gap. So that said, we're right here at about the end. I'm about to run out of time. I don't want to go too far, but Huck, any thoughts or comments on that so far?
No, that's perfect. Kind of bridges that gap of saying, the scale is sometimes scary about what you can do, but being able to understand how you interact with it very, very easily, and to be able to create that security policy without having to worry or think too much. It's great. It looks like we have a question here. If you want to see, if anybody else has a question, by the way, and you want to go ahead and enter it in, we can address it. But question is what do you do if you're already managing credentials in another piece of software for the company? If you're storing it in other places, it seems like what I'm reading there.
Yeah, we see most commonly one of two things, right? The customers either they've got a really, really long or complex OneNote, or they've got an Excel document that has a nice little IP address, username, password combo. And that's how they're managing their devices today. Obviously, that's really hard to scale. It's hard to share access across multiple teams. And what if the IP address changes? Now your database is out of date, right? And so we see that all the time. We also see customers who have made an investment into a third-party credential management platform, like a CyberArk, a HashiCorp, or something similar. When those companies come to us and they have one of those platforms, the ask isn't, hey, how do we take the credentials out of those and put them into your environment there. It's how do I get the credentials that are in this OneNote into that site, into that PAM
Right.
in an automated fashion? And so what's great is we can handle all of those use cases. So we can actually on the back end create an integration either to the password managing vault system that they already have, or we can go in and actually import those credentials through a script in the back end to try and create that one-to-one matching. Either scenario, with Phosphorus, we then take over being the intermediary between those 2 points. And so we will keep everything up to date and do it all automatically and at scale.
Good. I think there was the follow-on was, what if you have 500 cameras? Do you have to set up new password and automation for each of them individually?
No, that's what's great is with Phosphorus, you go out and do discovery and we'll find all 500 cameras and we'll provide a very simple UI where you can just check a box and say, hey, show me all of the cameras that are out of compliance essentially. And with just a couple clicks in the UI, you can create a job that goes out and rotates the credentials for all 500 of those devices. And we can do that over the course of just an evening, right? It's just one night's worth of work instead of logging into 500 different cameras individually, which would take days or weeks instead of months.
Make it easy for me. Make it easy for me. All
Exactly.
right. Well, we then thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I don't think there was any other questions, but thank you again for joining. I just want to remind everybody here and remind your friends, if you want to be able to get through and we can take you through the Phosphorus 15-30-60 rule, which allows you to say, hey, we'll be able to show you how we can find your assets within 15 minutes, have you start hardening those things and doing updates with passwords like we just talked about in 30 minutes, and help you start remediating issues across those like firmware updates within 60 minutes. We love to be able to take the challenge with you. Our next episode is going to be from Black Hat. If you are at Black Hat, you want to have some discussion with it, just reach out. We'd love to be able to talk with you a little bit more about what we do. Otherwise, we'll have our next show from Black Hat.